Most of us have been in the place where we've poured out our hearts in prayer to God, and for all we can tell, the only response we got was silence. It's one of the reasons people tell you why they don't think religion is worthwhile for them. I believe you know me well enough to know by now that I've been in that place myself. I've told you about my 2 divorces. What I may not have told you is that I prayed for years, for my marriages to be healed and whole and stable. I prayed for my family to stay together, both times. I would say that the greatest disappointments of my life have been going through 2 divorces, despite doing everything humanly possible, and despite pouring out my heart in prayer to God for years to keep them intact. I understand why people who go through deeply discouraging experiences like that back away from church. When I went through my first divorce, I was so heartbroken that I wasn't sure I even wanted to be in ministry any longer. I kept going to church because I needed the support I found there. But I wasn't entirely sure whether God had failed to live up to His end of the bargain. My faith was shaken for several years. To some extent, I had to rely on the faith of my friends in order to get through that time in my life. It was their faith that helped me to reclaim my faith. And it was their faith that helped me to find my way back to ministry. After several years of trying other things, it was my incredibly unimpressive performance as a realtor that convinced me that despite my shortcomings, I belonged in ministry. Last week we talked about some of the reasons why we participate in this church. One of the reasons why I continue to come to church is because I rely on the faith of my friends at times. I want to continue that theme of why we participate in this church. Our psalm reading for today calls attention to one of the reasons we highlighted last week. We come to church because we've made a decision to raise our children in a community of faith. But precisely how to do that isn't as straightforward as it used to be. As I alluded to last week, we're trying to plant seeds of faith in children and young people who are inundated with all kinds of messages. We're definitely trying to carry out the work of teaching the next generation in what the business world would call a competition-rich environment. As you know, there are a lot of opinions out there as to how to reach this generation. The psalmist answers that question in a very traditional way. If you want the next generation to thrive, make sure to keep telling the story of what God has done. And the psalmist said to do it in a way that's compelling so that each generation should set its hope anew on God. Unfortunately, if we were to read the rest of the psalm, we would hear that from Israel's history, that telling of the story of what God had done doesn't necessarily guarantee that every generation will actually set its hope anew on God. That's one of the challenges of trying to reach younger generations. We can tell the story, and we can do it well, and it doesn't guarantee that they'll respond. It's the risk that goes along with faith. The outcomes aren't guaranteed. In fact, as the psalmist recounts time after time, those who actually witnessed firsthand God's great wonders turned away from faith. The psalmist says that they forgot what God had done. In the face of a long history of unbelief, Writing generations later, the psalmist continues the tradition of telling the story of God's saving wonders so that future generations would trust in God. And in fact, as we heard in our scripture reading, he envisions the effect of telling the story not only on the children of his day. He believed that each generation has the responsibility to recount God's wonders so that the next generation might know them, even the children not yet born, and they in turn will teach their own children. Faithfully telling the story of what God has done will impact a generation not yet born. Even now, what we do here will impact a generation not yet born. Beyond that, continuing to tell the story will lead future generations to pass it on to their children. But I think we also have to read between the lines a bit with this psalm, because it's not only important to keep telling the story of what God has done to ensure that future generations will have a faith to pass on to their children. Part of the problem recounted in the psalm was that in every generation there were adults who were raised with the stories of God's great wonders who then forgot what God had done. It's not only children who need to be told the story of what God has done to plant seeds of faith in them. All of us, whatever age we may be, need to hear the story again and again to nurture the seeds of faith within us. Wherever we are in the development of our faith, whether a seed or a sprout or a sapling or a mature tree, our faith continually needs nourishment from the story of what God has done for us. Some of you may know that I've participated in Al-Anon for years. People get confused about that. I'm not an alcoholic. In fact, I rarely drink alcoholic beverages. Those of us who participate in Al-Anon are there because our lives have been affected by someone with a problem with alcohol. I recently had a discussion with a newcomer to our meeting who thought that as a pastor I should have the right prayer that would help her save her alcoholic son. In the process of trying to help her understand that's not the way it works, she asked me why I, as a pastor, still find it important to participate in a group like Al-Anon. I tried to tell her that we all share our experience, strength, and hope, and in so doing, we encourage one another to make healthy choices in our lives. That's just as important for someone who's been there for decades as it is for someone who's brand new. I think that's the gist of what I want to say on this Stewardship Commitment Sunday. There are some people who have the notion that we'll go to church long enough to get our children through confirmation. But my question is where that leaves their children and their children's children. We support the work of this church with our service, our faithfulness, our telling of the story, as well as our contributions, to ensure that we're doing everything we possibly can to plant seeds of faith in our children. But we also continue to do so in the hope that future generations will set their hope on God. More than that, the truth is that none of us ever outgrows the need to nourish our faith. That's especially true when we face hard times. The disappointments and discouragements we may encounter along the way can bring us to the point where we need the faith of our friends in this church family to help us make it through and recover our faith on the other side. We support the work of this church because it takes all of us working together to keep planting seeds of faith and to keep nurturing those seeds that may have become distressed by the heat of loss or the drought of discouragement in everyone whose lives we touch. May God grant us grace and faith that we may continue to invest our lives in the life of this church, not only for the sake of future generations, but also for the sake of our friends among us who need our faith to sustain them.